about to hear a revolution in talk radio, Liberty Talk Radio, where the critical thinking will defrag your mind of propaganda-ridden viruses induced by mass media news programming. No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly. Wow. In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, it's time for us to take back control of our government now before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, and our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back. And this program is just about that. Today, we're pleased and honored to have as a returning guest Mr. Jim Mosquera. He's the author of Escaping Oz, An Observer's Reflection. We had him on last Thursday, and we had a technical problem, so he came back today. So we appreciate that. In today's economic and political environment, protecting yourself means asking the right questions. You can ask the right questions if your mind encumbered with what you think you might understand. Who's the man behind the curtain? What's this thing called money? And Jim, thank you very much for being patient with us and our technical problems and returning to our show.
Well, Joe, I guess this is kind of an encore presentation for us today, isn't it?
It sure is. That's a good way of putting it. Jim, let me start. In your book, the goal was is to make people think. First, can you tell me, you say escaping Oz, define Oz, what are we escaping, and what's the major problem?
Well, I think when you had me on with my first book, this is going back, I guess, to 2011, when I wrote Escaping Oz, Protecting Your Wealth During the Financial Crisis, I mentioned that I tried to create a metaphor for our progression through the economy, like Dorothy and her trip to, through Oz and to see the Great Wizard. And the wizard, or wizards, plural, in my books refer to those entities that, we view, or the populace views, as having these kind of magical cosmic powers. And within that body would exist entities like central banks, in our case, the Federal Reserve, and government as well. And so I think the population has gotten accustomed to our economic ills being resolved, if you will, or even managed by those wizard entities. In the story of The Wizard of Oz, the movie The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy saw the wizard the first time, he was this, he breathed fire, there was smoke, loud. I mean, he was a very intimidating character, and of course the intimidation ended once the dog, Toto, went around and pulled the curtain back. So metaphorically, what I sought to do in these books is, again, pull the curtain back. Like you mentioned, we're trying to unencumber our minds. Well, we can't unencumber our minds until we pull that curtain back, and then we see the wizards for who they are, which are, I'm not denigrating, they're just ordinary, men and women. Ordinary men and women do not have, magical powers. They can't sprinkle fairy dust over the economy to make things happen. Now, they've tried to manage the process. We've had a great deal of economic management, as you know, since 2008, but the results are, very, very mixed, and they have led to, some of the political discourse, if you will, that is occurring today.
Yeah. Well, when Donald Trump was running for office, before he was President Trump, he was talking up a big, fat, ugly bubble, and that was one of the many statements that he made that helped catapult him into the White House. Now, in fact, just this morning, I heard him say, look at the stock market. It keeps on going up. That's proof of the progress that we're making in our economy. It's never been higher. Now, are you saying that in your book that people no longer think, they don't remember when he said it was a big, fat, ugly bubble, and they're not saying to themselves, wait a minute, that's a con game. You're using both sides of the coin, for one purpose. This is not right. You gotta take your choice. And every time he says that, I absolutely shudder when he says that. I get absolutely disgusted. But I wonder if people are thinking the same way, or people are saying, "Oh, geez, these are doing a wonderful job."
Stock markets are probably the quintessential reflection of social mood, of society's mood, and you can track that historically and see, when we've had periods of positive social mood and negative social mood very closely correlated to the stock market. Let's remind our viewers and listeners about one simple thing here. Before the November election last year, the stock market had baked in, and I'm using quotes, a victory by the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, and the market was, quote, proceeding in that fashion. If you remember, maybe you don't, on the day of the election, the night of the election, in overnight futures trading, I believe the Dow fell as much as 700 points when it became apparent that El Donaldo was going to win the election. And yet, and then it turned around, obviously, very quickly, and, we're up, 15, 20% since he got elected. Well, what did that tell me? And I was saying this to people at the time. I was very, very clear that it did not matter who was going to win the election, whether it was Hillary or Don. Either one, the trajectory of the stock market was going to be the same. Why? Because the underlying social mood, as reflected by the stock market and some other economic measures, was positive. So, if they had elected Joe Cristiano president in 2016, the stock market would be behaving just as well. Now, the what's baked into the stock market now is the projection of, well, when Donald Trump gets in the office, we're going to have regulatory reform, we're going to have tax reform, we're going to reform the Affordable Care Act, right? Well, those were, three planks on which he ran. Well, how many of those things have occurred thus far, right? None. And in his mind, probably the easiest one to take care of, and maybe the Republicans' mind, was what? The Affordable Care Act. Right. Well, the Affordable Care Act revision, replacement, whatever you want to call it, has exposed the deep crevices, if you will, the fissures that are existing right now in the Republican Party, right? I mean, it was exposed for all to see. On the one side, you have the Freedom Caucus, the former, Tea Partiers, who are taking a harder stand. You have more moderate Republicans. I think Susan Collins' name was mentioned in there. And then you have others, like the Democrats, of course, that were going to oppose any revision to the act itself, even though by their own admission, the act needs to be revised. So, what the biggest danger right now in the stock market is that mentally, after the rationalization, okay, Hillary's not going to win, let's turn it from the 700-point overnight move in the stock market. We've got this guy now, he says he's going to do all this. That buoys our positive social mood because he's going to accomplish these things. Well, none of those things have been accomplished. Congress is in recess until right after the Labor Day holiday. Just about 3 weeks after that, they're going to face probably the mother of all decisions with the debt ceiling. And I was having a discussion this morning on another podcast about that. No one's talking about the debt ceiling. The oxygen in Washington, D.C. and our airwaves is mostly consumed with Russia, right? And obviously North Korea lately. Nobody's talking about the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling that we have right now is a temporary measure. Can you imagine what's going to happen with those negotiations on the debt ceiling? I mean, something pretty grave that needs to be addressed when they haven't been able to resolve the Affordable Care Act, and you have obviously a single party, in power.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that on one hand, we have the debt ceiling that you're right, we're almost ignoring, and we're going to wait till the very last minute. They're going to be working overnight and screw things up even further, and at the same time, President Trump gets on television and says, well, we are going to invest $1 trillion in additional infrastructure improvements. Well, if you've exceeded all the money you have, and now you've overexceeded all the money you have, and you have no money, where's this additional $1 trillion going to come from? I mean, talking about the being in the Wizard of Oz, I mean, he makes the Wizard of Oz look legitimate at this point.
Well, and he, he's somebody that by his own admission, he doesn't read. I don't know how well versed he is on economic topics. The Congressional Budget Office, I'm glad you mentioned the $1 trillion infrastructure. The Congressional Budget Office has forecast that I think between 2020 and 2030, or maybe even less, so over the course of a decade, the national debt is going to grow by another $10 trillion. And keep in mind, Congressional Budget Office projections are typically off on the low side, right? And this is before we've done any infrastructure spending and so forth. I go back to what I mentioned earlier. You've got these fissures within the Republican Party. Can you imagine the people that are in the Freedom Caucus right now saying, yeah, we're going to spend X, right? I mean, their focus over the last few years is, the Obama administration is out of control spending. They've doubled our funded national debt from 10 to $20 trillion. How receptive you think they're going to be, right, to spending all this money on infrastructure and doing some of these other things? And again, I go back to maybe one of the easier things that they thought they were going to tackle, right, because they supposedly had 7 or 8 years to think about it and ruminate how they were going to replace the Affordable Care Act. That hasn't happened.
Right. Well, you don't hear such things as words such as returning whatever the program is back to the free market, getting government out, reducing the size of government, eliminating all these secretaries of fill in the blank. All of that you don't see. You don't hear any words like that. You don't hear Department of Education. Why have it? Why don't we question that? All we do is put children in school in prison for 13 years, learning nothing, and I can go on about that for at least 3 hours. But I mean, we have all these major problems that can be solved if we got government out of the way. But you don't hear anything in that regard. And all we hear is how government is going to solve the problems. We don't hear government or people in government or President Trump saying, the only way you can solve this problem is through a free market system, the same market system that allowed me to become a multi-billionaire.
I'm so glad you brought that topic up, because the underlying theme of the book that you referenced earlier, which is this Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflections, I talk a lot about what I call the freedom of and freedom from.
Right.
And that's also an underlying theme in my fictional books as well. But we've really overbalanced, if you will, right now to freedom from. And let me explain. When the Constitution was codified, we talked about freedom of what? Speech, expression, and freedom. Of course, we had the Bill of Rights. What we've done since that time is we've deviated and we've asked for freedoms from things. So freedom from maybe some physical suffering, and I don't mean from a criminal perspective. We have freedom from old age penury, right? We don't have enough money. Freedom from health issues. We continually ask government to do more. And not only do we ask them to do more from a legislative perspective, but as you mentioned earlier, we've created this edifice in different departments. And I don't really want to debate whether we should have one department, cabinet secretary, or another. But when we ask for more, government willingly gives us more, right? And they give it to us via the legislative process. They give it to us with laws, rules, and regulations. And so when you have all that, it costs more money to do that. And you're layering more and more, and it becomes very, very complicated. You hear small businesses today, which is what I work with, they complain about, obviously, a lot of the rules and regulations that tend to stifle them and stifle creativity and so forth. That's something that I think is at the most fundamental, that what we need to debate in this country is, what do we want from freedom of and freedom from? And just so everybody understands that the more freedoms from we ask, the more layering of that authority we're going to get, okay? And we cannot escape that. And that layering of authority is also known as the deep state, So it doesn't matter whether, Hillary gets elected or Don gets elected in 2016, that deep state or that bureaucracy, it doesn't go away, right? It's just a new person that occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Yeah. And so until you start thinking about, from an American perspective, what you want government to do, we're gonna have these discussions forever until something more cataclysmic happens, and and it puts other stresses on government because of fiscal issues.
Yeah, it seems that every time that there's a problem, the first thing we do is look to the federal government for a solution. For example, the march on with the Confederate flags in Virginia, et cetera, and then a car, ran into a bunch of protesters or marchers or whatever, and then of course all pandemonium broke out. I thought that in there, I was hoping that to me that's a state issue. that the governor would have come out and said something. But everyone was looking for Donald Trump to say something. And I was hoping he would not. I hope he would say, that's an unfortunate situation. We shouldn't be behaving that way. It's a state issue. Let's hear from the governor. Let's bring it back down to the people. But we keep on elevating it back up to the executive branch. Everything. If I ever run out of toilet paper, I'm calling the President of the United States. I ran out of toilet paper. I mean, it's a stupid comment, obviously, but I mean, it seems like anytime anything happens, we go straight to the president. He has to find a solution. We can't do anything ourselves anymore.
Yeah, and I like you I've gotten to the point now where a friend of mine and I were having this discussion yesterday that the federal government needs a title called the denouncer in chief. So anytime any ill comes up, that somebody's immediately there to denounce it. And it's really, really tough nowadays because you may have somebody that spews something homophobic or, racially insensitive that comes out on social media, right? And which means it happens instantaneously. And you're expecting the White House to react to that, even though they may not, right? And you have this president, obviously, that tends to communicate a lot, via, not a lot, almost exclusively through his social media account. So, yeah, I have mixed views on, whether the president has to stand up. And regardless, I would say the same thing if Barack Obama was in office, where, once an ill occurs, that the president has to immediately step up to denounce it. When I think it's almost like there's a false equivalency there. It'd be like you telling me, well, Jim, I didn't hear you denounce the Nazi Party yesterday. Well, but why do you assume, intrinsically that I support them, right? And that's kind of what's going on. There's kind of that false equivalency.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to bring that up, by the way. I'm only kidding. But just like if there is a shooting in Detroit, that's not a state issue. It definitely is not a federal issue. It's a city issue, and the mayor of that city is directly responsible. And if anyone's going to make a comment, it should be the mayor. But no, we wait for the President of the United States to make a comment, and then when he does, they say, well, he used this word instead of that word. I think it would have been stronger if he said this, and I denounce him for saying that because he didn't include that. And you go, talking about escaping Oz, I want to escape Oz at this point,
Well, and one thing that's interesting, too, is that I talk about in this book is when we have this profusion of laws and so forth, oftentimes you mentioned everybody reaches out to Washington. Well, one of the things that happens is when you make a law or a rule or regulation that's a long way, a great distance away from you, it creates more of that insensitivity, to the person if it's a bureaucrat making that law. To your point, if in the case of, let's say there was a shooting in a particular city, imagine, what would happen if the federal government, overlaid some regulations or rules upon that city as a result of that. I mean, wouldn't you, as a citizen of Detroit, want that problem to be managed more locally?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what I actually talk about even in the predecessor Escaping Oz book, Navigating the Crisis, is that as we move forward in time, I think we need to look at what I'll call smaller governing units and, not reflexively just want to push everything off towards Washington, D.C., because we can actually probably do a better job, more cost-effective job by managing these problems locally.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you said sometimes facts challenge deep-seated beliefs. Can you give me some examples of that?
Wow. Let me.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Let me refer to something that I mentioned in the book. I think you and I were talking about this last week when we were just on audio, and I talked about something that was called the words of the year. And there's some words of these are the most searched words on Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. So it has nothing to do with Google or other search engines. It's like, hey, I want to know what a word means. And what's interesting is when you go through this process, you see, again, back to that barometer of social mood. And one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting is in 2016, I have to make a reference here, the word for 2016, the most searched word, was something called post-truth, okay? And I had never heard of what the heck post-truth was. And it probably showed up a lot on social media. So let me read to you what post-truth says. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, the word is an adjective defined as, quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinions than appeals to emotional or personal belief. So that's kind of what you just mentioned. It's like when facts start to challenge people, right? You kind of get that cognitive dissonance, and people don't want to believe that. And so it makes a lot of sense that, a lot of the things that you're seeing now, obviously what happened in Charlottesville, a lot of this political strife that's occurring is that you have these, a chapter in my book, it's called Closed Minds, right? And if somebody's presenting objective facts to you, and you're basically falling back into this post-truth, way of thinking, it's more about, hey, what appealed to you emotionally or to your personal beliefs as opposed to facts.
Yeah. You think you would find that among the very young, maybe the college students, the people just out of high school or whatever. But I will go to a business meeting with professionals, everything from consultants to attorneys to businessmen or women, and if I say something that is inconsistent with what they hear on mainstream television, they look at me like I've absolutely lost my mind, and sometimes they get angry. I mean, we're not discussing it, we're not debating anything, but they almost get angry, and it makes me reluctant to say anything because I'm not sure the way they think. I don't understand the way they think. It's like I have to repeat what I hear on television, or I'm going to be in a contest with them explaining what I mean, when what I mean is very simple. I mean, I'm not saying anything complicated. And it makes me reluctant to even have a conversation among people and I'm talking about people in their 50s and 60s and even 70s, by the way.
Yeah, and so what you're talking about is exemplifying that concept of an echo chamber. So people are living within the echo chamber, and that echo chamber is manifested by what you watch on TV. Is it CNN? Is it Fox News? Something else on your Facebook, on Twitter, right? So we've tended to gravitate, and I mentioned this in the book. We've tended to gravitate towards that echo chamber and people that only think like we do. However, that's a problem societally because societally, we need to have that diversity of thought. We've encouraged a lot of, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and so forth, which is great. And in my former life in a corporate environment, one of a side job that I had was I actually taught a class on corporate diversity, and we talked about race and then, physical features that people had, and why it was important to consider them still as valuable contributors, even though they might be different from us. But what we've done is, we've had this segregation not only of thought, but even of geography, right? If you look at an electoral map of the United States, you tend to see blue up in the Northeast and in the West Coast, and then, red in between. And then even within a state, you'll have, like in my state as an example, the rural areas tend to be more red. The city areas, the city cores in Kansas City and St. Louis tend to be more blue, right? And then I read a book a long time ago, and I cannot remember the name of it, where they even talked about the segregation occurring at a neighborhood level, right? And so Austin is a really good example where you have some areas of Austin that tend to be very liberal in today's definition of liberal, not Jim Mosquera's definition of liberal, and then very conservative, within the same town. So you've got all this segregation going on. You've got the echo chamber. So it's really, really difficult now to get people to kind of arrive in the middle, which was really a central reason for me writing that book, is I want to try to center that discussion again, because we're going like this,
right? And
the consequences of going like this are not good.
Well, aren't we dividing ourselves because we keep on looking up to the government to solve our problems? If I have a problem, I should solve it with the people that I'm having the problem with. We should come to an accord of some sort, an understanding. But if I keep on going to the government to solve our problem, it never gets resolved. I mean, it separates us, but it separates us permanently because we've never got to truly understand one another. And we're afraid to do that, it seems, except if you watch commercials, obviously.
Yeah, and so that's why, again, I've advocated, in some of my writings is I want to focus more on a local level, because oftentimes that's the problem can be solved, more readily, less expensively and so forth. But, there's something called an Article 5 convention. You and I talked about that, last week, that I think is a really exciting thing. And it actually the Article 5 convention process and became a scene and a focal point for my last novel, which I call Division, which I released in the spring, where the country, all these different things have happened in the country There's greater layers of authority. There's secession and separatist movements. And if you look at the cover of my book, Division, you'll see what I mean. But anyway, so there's this Article 5 convention. But moving back to reality, the Article 5 convention is a really exciting thing because it allows people to then move that governance, that governance, the bureaucracy, if you want to call it that, back to a closer level. Now, that's a process that will take a long time to occur. You need, 2/3 of the states to even be able to form the Article 5 convention to then have, discussions about, what proposals will be debated to then even become an amendment to then get voted on. And then if they get ratified by 3/4 of the state, they can become reality.
Right. Well, it just seems that the government would not allow or doesn't encourage, or we don't learn in our prison system. I'm sorry, school system. I'm sorry. I still
slip of the tongue there, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I consider putting children to school is the worst idea in the world. It's 13 years of prison, as far as I'm concerned, not worth the damn. But that's another subject. But it seems that the government doesn't trust the people to eventually come together to resolve their own problems. And I'll give you, maybe this is a ridiculous example. When I was 15 years old, going back 60 years, but when I, really, it's actually going back 59 years. My friend Butch and I were in the northern part of Manhattan, and we were at a party, had a great time, and we decided to walk home, walk to the Interborough Rapid Transit line, the IRT, which is the subway to home. And of course, being numbnuts that we were, we decided to take the west side IRT rather than the east side because it saved us a block of walking. Well, you have to know the neighborhood. At the time, there were a lot of gang wars going on and whatever, and there was a lot of racial division. Well, we went through a black territory, and all of a sudden, the entire block surrounded us. There must have been 40 black guys, and Butch and I are walking in the middle of the street, and Butch turns around to me and said, "Joe, let's run." I said, "Are you kidding me? We're dead if we run, And there's a story behind this, by the way. So I said, "Butch, just play along with me. We're going to try something. I don't know if this will work. If not, we're dead, So what we did is we actually walked into this gigantic crowd of guys in the middle of the street, and this is like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I almost pushed the guys out of the way, pointed my finger at one of the guys and said, "You sing with the Rendells." And all of a sudden, everybody went quiet because I sang in a doo-wop. I sang doo-wop when I was in Harlem, in New York, And the guy says, "No, I don't." But he did sing. I was lucky as all hell. He did sing. And of course, the Rendells. I made up the name. And we start singing together, and we left the best of friends. Now, the only reason why I'm telling you, that's a true story, by the way. I mean, we lived, and I was surprised we did. But my point being is that we took a bad situation, a desperate situation, and something very positive came out of it because no one was solving the problem but the people there. We solved the problem. We were no longer the enemy. We also sang, doo-wop. And by the way, that group was so good. They were so good. I was about 15, 16 years old at the time. I thought to myself, I wish I was a little older, had some money. I would manage this group. I'd make $1 million. They were fantastic, In fact, I sang with them, and I wasn't nearly as good as they were, but they thought I was okay, But we left the best of friends. We can solve, my point is, we can solve our own problems. We have the ability to do that if we keep our minds open, if we think positively, and we find something to connect with other people and build on that connection. But government can't do that. Government could only divide, take from one and give to the other, and usually at the dissatisfaction of both people. Why can't we learn that as a society? Why can't we tell government, get the hell out of the way?
Well, and a great story, by the way. And I would say it's even more than government. It's the political parties. Look at what happened in the 2016 election. The political parties sought to divide rather than unite. And you could say, well, they're competing against each other, surely. But the podcast I was on this morning, I mentioned that the 2016 election, what did we learn about either candidate, right? About what they were going to do for the country. Literally nothing, right? Because it was just nothing but, personal attacks, ad hominem attacks, what have you. there's a scene, there's a chapter that I have in the book, an article where I mentioned that we really have more in common with each other than we think. And there was an exercise that this professor did where he got a group of people together, and it was multiracial, multi-ethnic. And then he had them like in a line, kind of, standing facing him. And then he said, okay, if you possess this characteristic, come over and move into this circle. And so, a bunch of people would move in. And so he went through this exercise several times. And what the people realized is that every time he called out something, there were a lot more people in that circle than there were not, And so the implication is that there's a lot more common that we have than
Sure.
that's not common. But the political parties and the bureaucracy, and you mentioned Washington, D.C., the federal government have really not done anything to, to foment, if you will, that unity that we have. And, there's so many things that I see today, the Affordable Care Act, the immigration policy and so forth, that I don't think we're really having honest discussions about it. And I go back, I'm sorry to harp on this point, the freedom from and the freedom of. Yeah. And again, until we kind of have that clarity in our mind about, what we think the role of federal government should be, which to me is just the very, very first conversation that needs to happen. And I wish somebody that was running for president or different elected office would bring that topic up, because it would help have a more intelligent and rational discussion about something like the Affordable Care Act or health care in general. And I give an example in the book where I dedicated a few pages to healthcare, or what I call government. And there's an article called Government in Healthcare, another one called Government in Sports. And the government in healthcare one is interesting because, I would ask, anybody that's listening right now is, do you think that healthcare is a right? Do you think government should provide that? Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to answer that for you. I think that's a question that everybody needs to ask and then answer. And then once they answer that question, ask, okay, if it is a right, then government should provide it. And how are you willing to have them provide that for you? So I'm going to give you a personal example now. I think I've mentioned to you before, I'm an immigrant from the country of Panama, the one with the canal. And when I was born in a public hospital, so, what you consider free health care. And that's where I was born. And my dad was a doctor at the time, and he said, okay, well, you're going to be born here. A few years later, when my sister was born, about 4 years later, she was born in a private clinic, not public institution. And it wasn't that my parents were, swimming in money or anything like that, but they thought, hey, you know what, we're going to have her over here. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand, and I think you're going to hear this, by the way, especially as you move towards 2020, if something happens in the economy and you hear more strident voices from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, more calls, and especially if the ACA doesn't get resolved, you're going to hear more calls for, it's called single payer, however you want to phrase it. When you have a single payer system or a single provider system, then you end up with what I call a bifurcation of healthcare. And what I mean by that is, does everybody have access to healthcare? Yeah, absolutely. But understand what free means, right, with healthcare. Free means some of the things that you see, and I don't want to put like the most egregious examples that I see sometimes cited, like, oh, here's Cuba and, Venezuela. I don't mean that. I think better examples might be what you see in Europe, perhaps Canada. There are stresses that get put on economic systems, and the healthcare would be kind of an economic subsystem within the entire economy. Healthcare is a service. We can't get away from that. It's a service that's provided by, nurses, doctors, hospitals, and so forth. Would we ask for a free service for other service providers, right? Let's say somebody that repairs automobiles. What if somebody says, well, automobiles are so important that we need that mechanics should provide, or the government should provide that. We should have a single payer for our auto repair bills, right? So, and again, I'm oversimplifying the example because it shows you what happens when you have economic subsystems and then we try to make them free. So if that were to happen here, you'd have a bifurcated health system where the people that had, maybe more money could go to a private clinic, right, and maybe have their services there, maybe have membership plans. In Panama right now, if you're there, you could get free health care from government. It's not even single payer; it's a government provided hospital, and you can get service there, and it might be good, right? It may not be. You may be waiting a long time because there's too much demand on it. Or, you might belong to a hospital that has membership. Joe, you pay, $100 a month and you get all the health care you want. Maybe these services cost a little more and so forth. So there's so many things that I think, especially about the healthcare, that we're just not having honest discussions about. And not to mention that from my recollection of my risk and insurance class in college, you have an inherent moral hazard with what we call health insurance right now, which is nobody shops for anything. I mean, when was the last time that you went on the internet? Like, you'd go to Amazon right now to shop for, right. I see a flag over there, behind you. You'd say, well, I want to go look for a cheap flag. Nobody says, hey, I want to go look for, real inexpensive blank fill in the service, right? Because you automatically know that, you're not going to, no one ever advertises the prices of, these different things. So it's, the way it works is completely a violation of, what I learned as moral hazard. We have built-in moral hazard. We insure things that, back to the car metaphor, where, nobody insures your car for, tire changes, oil changes, none of that, right? It's more for liability and accident. But we don't treat healthcare that way, right? We want to insure, normal, preventative type, maintenance events. And so the philosophy behind our healthcare and, the discussion about, what, quote, free healthcare would mean has really gotten, perverted. And let me add just one final point. When the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2011, that was signed by President Obama, there were a lot of people that were decrying it, saying, well, this is just a government takeover of healthcare, blah, 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 blah. Well, here's a reminder for everyone. If you add up the number of people that are on Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Plan, and veterans, you have close to half the population of the United States right there, okay?
Right.
And so government was already, and again, this is part of the honest discussion about it, government was already deeply, deeply in the healthcare business. And then you threw in the Affordable Care Act, which is probably another, 20, 30 million people. So when you add all that up, you have well over half the population that was on some form of, a government-managed, single-payer type healthcare. And then throwing on top of that, you've got people that have private health insurance through an employer like I used to have, where you have these big insurance pools, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, you were talking earlier about having these discussions. You cannot have this discussion about, government and healthcare and so forth until you honestly just reflect. And I haven't heard anybody on TV say this. Like, why are we saying, why are we feeling so negative about government in healthcare? Because it's already deeply in healthcare. And I would add one more thing. If you take our current system of healthcare and all of the different organizations that manage it, you have Medicare, which is managed at the federal level. You have Medicaid at both the state and federal level. You have Veterans Affairs. I mean, if you ever move to a single payer health system in the United States, I would suggest that it might be more efficient, in some respects than you have now, because you could get rid of all of these overlapping organizations and just say, okay, you're just going to have a Medicare plan for all. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that Jim Mosquera advocates for a single payer health system. All I'm saying is that, you have to either be here or there. You either think that it's a right that needs to be provided by the government or it's not. And if it is a right, then here's how it needs to be architected. But just keep in mind what free means in a healthcare environment.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, if to use the metaphor you use, if government did in fact consider auto repair a right, because everyone needs a car to get to work, an oil change would cost $360, and that's a problem. But what I really object to is, I object to the whole program. I object government getting involved in any aspect of health care because they call it insurance, and it's not insurance. Insurance is like when you buy a house, you get insurance, and fire insurance, for example.
Well, it's called an insurable risk. That's the thing. And most of these health events that people have aren't insurable risks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you don't buy the insurance because you're going to burn your house down next year. I mean, the likelihood, if you live in this house for 20, 30, 40 years, that the house will never burn down, but every month you make a small contribution to the insurance company, to insure against that risk. And when enough people do that, should something happen to your house, the insurance company has put aside, during actuary tables on it, so much aside to cover the cost of replacing your house. Now, it doesn't mean that my neighbor next door gets mad that his house didn't burn down, because, I got a new roof or a new facade of the house, but he didn't. But that's insurance. This is not insurance. What this is simple welfare. Now, why does not the government say we want socialistic medicine? We want to expand our socialistic medicine network. Because then there's association to socialistic. We associate that with the communist countries or the South American countries. We don't want that. We don't call it socialistic. It is socialistic medicine. We want socialized medicine. They will not use the word socialized medicine.
Well, I tell you what, I'll make a small prediction here. If you see some economic shocks between now and the 2020 election and nothing gets resolved with the ACA, I will contend strongly that one of the platforms on which the Democratic Party, and whether it's the Democratic Party as it's presently constituted right now, or how it may take shape with what I'll call the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren kind of more progressive movement, I have no doubt that that's going to be a plank in their platform, because I think you're going to have more people, as an example, if there's a spike in unemployment, maybe the people that are on private health insurance today, they're not going to have that access to insurance, and maybe the Affordable Care Act in their state, maybe there's not many providers, or the premiums are super high, and so we know that it's a mess. And I guess my overall feeling, I think we've probably hit this subject pretty long and hard now, but we just need to have an honest conversation about it. And whether if somebody's going to call it socialized medicine, whatever they call it. And I guess it's probably me with my engineer hat on, because that's my academic training is engineering. I see problem, and what do engineers do? You come up with solutions. You try to fix things.
Yeah.
And that's, some people don't like that out of engineers. But I mean, I see problems, and you can't. When you open the show, you said you can't have these discussions until you ask the right questions. Well, we're not asking the right questions right now.
Right, and go back. The goal of the book was to make people think. Well, we're not thinking, and it's difficult to think when we call Elizabeth, well, she calls herself a progressive. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I'm progressive too. I'm a very progressive guy. I've been working all my life. I've always been trying to improve things. Am I not a progressive person? But yet I'm a free market guy. But she calls herself a progressive. Why does she call herself a socialist? Say what you are. I'm a socialist. I believe in the socialist form of government. Screw this free market crap.
Let me give you my political spectrum, and my political spectrum, as I outline in the book, does not look like I think today, and it is characterized in the media, the political spectrum is conservative Republican or liberal Democrat. And see, that's not my political spectrum at all. My political spectrum is way over here on one side, whether you want to call it the left or right. You have super liberty, and maybe in some respects that's chaos, because you have no rules or anything like that. And on the other side, you have totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and so forth, And so what we have, so that's the continuum, right? And I tend to be a little bit more towards this side, which is more towards the libertarian side, okay?
Right.
And if you think about it, that's the way our country was founded, right?
That's right.
I mean, our country was founded more on those libertarian principles. If you go through the Constitution, you'll see that, what is it? It talks about the inalienable rights of the individual, right? That those rights aren't conferred by government. They're already ours, right? And so I tend to believe more about that, and by the way, I think the technology is going to probably support a lot of those rights anyway. But what we've done is we've moved closer over here to the, authoritarian, totalitarian mode. And I would put Republicans and Democrats, again, closer in that, within that continuum. Now, There are some differences between the two, but in that continuum that I just drew, they're more over here on this side than they are on the other side.
Correct. All right. Now, we have a couple of minutes, but you've got to give me your forecast. What's going to happen to this country? I have always been concerned about this country. This is the first time in my life I have been afraid for this country and where it's going. I don't like what I suspect will happen, but I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know. But I am more concerned today than I ever have in my life. I need someone to give me some direction. Please do that right now.
Well, financially, we're in the middle of a great deal of kind of that euphoric kind of, last stage speculative mania that you see. And we talked earlier about the wizards. The wizards have created these chases for yield because, maybe you have money in the bank, but you're getting basically no interest for it. And that policy has just decapitated, and I'll use that word, decapitated savers. You mentioned earlier about the insurance companies. One thing that people think about is like, well, insurance companies, they take in their premiums and they pay out claims. Well, but a lot of what they also need to make money on, are their own investments, and they're not. So you have a pension crisis. Think about this. You have a pension crisis right now because, or in spite of the fact that you have stocks at all-time highs, bonds near all-time highs. And so if you're at that stage now, imagine what it's going to look like, when things aren't quite as rosy. So I think you're in the late stages of a financial euphoria, again, that has been, the Fed has been obviously a great catalyst for that, after they reflated after 2008. We never got to experience the catharsis. And so what I would tell people is that all of those areas where this excess liquidity has funneled into, whether that's stocks, whether that's real estate, bonds, especially, in some respects, foreign currencies. We talked about cryptocurrencies the other day, not attacking the technology behind it because there's a lot of positive things, but there is a speculative euphoria that's going on with those right now. Anywhere where you see, that all of that excess liquidity that's flowed into at the deflationary, point of inflection, then that'll turn in the other direction. And so you'll see something that looks worse than what you had in 2008. Now, on the political front, if that happens before the next election, obviously it's going to present some unbelievable headwinds for the 45th president, who's never had anything close to that in his life. He can't do what he did when he was a businessman, where he says, okay, well, I'm just going to declare bankruptcy with this company that I have. Well, you can't do that. You can't say, well, I'm going to declare bankruptcy with the United States. And I guess you could at some point. But anyway, big challenges there. And if and when that happens, in, let's say, 2018, 2019, or before the 2020 election, I think you will see the most explosive political environment in this country, and who knows, maybe ever, by the time the 2020 election comes around.
When I move to Ecuador, I'll call you, give you my address, and you can stay with me for a while, and we sit on the beach for a while and talk for some more. Because I tell you, I have never been pessimistic like this in my life, and I'm just every time I hear someone talk from the government, I yell at the TV set. My wife thinks I'm going nuts. She said, "Who are you talking to?" I said, "I'm yelling at the guy on the TV set." I said, "What he just said made absolutely no sense whatsoever."
Well, Joe, let's look at it this way. I would, let's say I'm short-term pessimistic, but long-term I'm always optimistic, because societies move on, economies move on. The one good thing that I think that we have as human beings all over the world is we have the ability to adapt, right? We've adapted to civilization changes, empire changes, world wars, et cetera. So I'm very, very confident. That what it looks like on the other side of that will look different than what it looks like now. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but you've got these you've got these points of inflection, and these significant societal and political and economic changes, and obviously it's going to look different on the other side.
Yeah, maybe we should all call the government and our government officials and say, would you say the word Constitution once in a while? Maybe it'll wake you up and make you realize what you're truly saying and how you're destroying this country, because you're not saying anything constitutionally. And I'll end it that. Jim, let me give you the last 30 seconds or so to close things up. And in advance, let me say that you are an absolutely fantastic guest. Love you having you on the program, and I do hope that you will accept that invitation to return at a later date.
Yeah, Joe, thanks a lot. Again, always spirited, good discussion to have. Hopefully your viewers got something out of it. Best place to look for my work is at my author website, jimmosquera.com, JIMMOSQUERA.com. You'll see all of the books that I published there. What I would say to people when you go to that site, you'll see kind of a compendium of nonfiction and fiction. The two types of work, actually, they work very cohesively, because the fictional work kind of has these messages that Joe and I have been talking about today, kind of transmitted through some of the characters, the messages of liberty and so forth. And there's a lot of technology in there as well, and, financial crisis and politics and so forth. So they're very, very realistic novels. Now, Joe, as you know, some of them are available on audio. Some of my work is available on audio. So for those that don't like to read and would rather listen, there's that avenue too.
Okay, Jim, thank you so much. Folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.